Well, hello there, watching the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages. Time then to see what is making the headlines with The Guardian's political editor, Pippa Crerar, and The Telegraph's associate editor for politics, Christopher Hope. And welcome to both of you. So to the front pages then, let us start with The Guardian. It reports that planned strikes by nurses and paramedics will go ahead later this week, with unions insisting the Health Secretary, Steve Barclay, hasn't done enough to resolve their disputes. But the Eye has a more positive take on it, suggesting the offer of a one-off lump sum payment could break the deadlock. The Daily Mirror takes offence at the notion that NHS staff should work harder if they want better pay. According to The Times, the NHS could start treating patients in temporary cabins in car parks in an effort to tackle capacity problems. The Metro carries new polling, which found that roughly 2/3 of respondents have a negative view of Prince Harry. The Express is once again outraged at the Duke of Sussex, this time at what it calls his cruel depiction of his stepmother, the Queen Consort Camilla. While the Mail says Harry doesn't think he'll ever move back to the UK. The Financial Times has word of a possible breakthrough in the long-running talks between the UK and the EU over post-Brexit trade in Northern Ireland. And the Star tells us there's a type of solar blast called a space burp, but apparently they're not to be scoffed at as they can cause electricity blackouts. Well, we're joined, as I said, by Pippa Crerar and Christopher Hope. Welcome to both of you. And Pippa, let's go straight to The Guardian, shall we? NHS strikes to go ahead as unions blame Minister for a failure of talks. Ministerial meetings in a number of sectors today. Is that at least positive? And were you expecting more from these meetings?
I think undoubtedly it's being regarded by both sides as positive that they're actually talking, and they're talking about pay. If you remember back before Christmas, the government was adamant that while conversations could take place and they were happy to meet with the unions, they didn't want those to be anything to do with pay. That they had to be about conditions or any other issue that working conditions, staffing, any of the other issues which might come up in the round. And there's been a shift over Christmas, and I'm sure we'll come on to why that might be later. But all of a sudden, there's been signals from the government, in Rishi Sunak's speech last week, then a letter from Steve Barclay to the health unions. Obviously, education and rail are being done separately by their respective departments, but health, which has become the most high-profile one because of the state of the NHS and the current crisis that it's going through, that unions were invited to speak to Steve Barclay this morning. And that in itself, I think, could be regarded as a breakthrough because it is obviously a new approach. There wasn't much movement in terms of a sort of a tangible offer on the table by the end of those talks. They were only 45 minutes long. I don't think anybody went into them, either the unions or the government, expecting resolution after the first round of talks, which is why the unions said afterwards, and we've reported, that the next lot of strikes in the health sector are going to go ahead. Of course, we've got an ambulance strike on Wednesday, and the next nurses strikes are due on January the 18th and 19th. So the strikes are on for now, but there will be more meetings over the coming days, and with health unions towards the end of this week. Steve Barclay at the end of them said he would go away with the unions' proposals about backdating next year's pay settlement and or a one-off flat rate payment for all health workers, and speak to the Treasury. So we'll see what they say. We'll see what they come back with towards the end of the week.
OK, that's interesting, isn't it? Because I think Unison's negotiator suggested there was a chink of optimism. And the two issues you talked about there, which The Guardian talk about, the lump sum payment or the backdating of future pay to end the NHS strikes, might explain some of the optimism we see on the front page of The Eye then, Christopher. Hope's rise of a breakthrough with a plan to backdate pay. So what is it that has changed? Is it all of those headlines over Christmas and New Year about how woeful it was for staff and patients in the NHS?
It's definitely focused minds. I think a lot of people have been going home, seeing family and friends, and you can probably count Rishi Sunak and others amongst that group. And they're wondering, well, we can't go on like this. certainly before Christmas, and Pippa heard the same as I did, that the Treasury was not budging on this. The entire conversation was all about 2023, 2024. We expected an early meeting to work out what those figures should be. So to have this conversation now, to talk about the current financial year, which Sunak himself said that this year is nearly over, when the Daily Mail interviewed him before Christmas. So no one expected this, really. And I think it shows how they are slightly wobbling, I think. They're still 22 points behind. The Sunak bounce has never really happened because the place in the party's place in the polls hasn't budged since he became Prime Minister. They were going to do something. I think a lot of concern on the Tory side might be if you start giving into this. What about these warnings about inflation and this being inflationary? And that's why it might be a one-off payment rather than an increase in actual pay.
And if we go to the Daily Mirror, this is the Unite negotiator who came out. I think many people pointing out that he had not actually been in the meeting, but suggested that it was going to be performance-linked, any benefits they received. And his outrage that the Health Secretary told struggling NHS workers to work harder. He said, effectively, that they can't work harder. They're already well past their hours already, Pippa.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the point that the Unite were in the talks, but this particular individual wasn't and came out looking as though he was, or sounding outraged, was slightly misleading. Unite anyway, I think, is the most sort of political, shall we say, of the unions, and also represent, compared to the other unions, particularly the GMB, Unison, obviously the RCN, the Royal College of Nursing, a relatively smaller number of staff in the NHS. It is primarily a private sector union rather than a public sector one. But the point that Unite was making was that it was an insult to their workers to suggest to NHS workers, many of whom we've seen on our screens over the last few weeks and in real life in our own personal engagements with the NHS, whether it's hospitals or GPs, work incredibly long hours and work incredibly hard. And the suggestion from Unite was, well, this isn't a factory and you can't, it's actually an insult to suggest that they need to increase productivity. However, I think it's really important to say that the government probably wasn't meaning individual workers need to work harder or put in longer hours. It's more about the state of the NHS system, that they regard that the system as it is at the moment isn't as productive or as efficient as it could be. And it does feel a little bit tone deaf because obviously frontline workers are really, are overstretched and overworked. But I think probably that's a communication problem on the part of the government, that they should have made clear, if they're talking about productivity and efficiency, that they should be highlighting the fact that actually it's about, in their view, making life easier really for those on the front line, making it more efficient, making the systems work better, rather than sort of flogging people to the working them to the bone, as some of the unions, or this union in particular, seems to have interpreted that push for. So I think there's a communication issue here. I can understand why the government wants to look at NHS reform, productivity and efficiency, but I think they need to be very clear that they're not talking about the effort that's put in by the individual workers that are currently considering going out on strike again.
Because the mood music, Christopher, from some people is very much that already the health service sucks up nearly half the nation's wealth. And how much more does it need? Yep. I mean, so what does need to happen then?
Well, I mean, that's a big question, Anna, for us for a Monday night. I think what we would say at the Telegraph is there needs to be a complete rethink of how we fund health in this country. Maybe a royal commission, maybe one where you have the input from both Labour, the Lib Dems, the Tories, to work out how we do it. Do we start charging for GP appointments to stop the missed appointments, which cost the NHS so much? Do we go towards a two-tier health service, as has been discussed in Scotland? These are the ideas you've got to talk about, because it is now draining this country of resources half the time, and it's so inefficient. There's a guy called Tim Briggs, Professor Tim Briggs. He's come in to try and he runs a thing called Get It Right First Time. They're trying to work, why do some trusts perform worse than other trusts? There's all sorts of ways to be more efficient. That doesn't mean work harder, but work, a bit smarter, to use that appalling term. But that's the idea. But it's a huge job of work. And of course, they are dealing with the fallout from the COVID pandemic and the big delay in operations.
Yes, and if you take a look at the top of the eye, just quickly again, a first-person account of an A&E doctor. I had to declare a patient dead on the waiting room floor in front of his wife and strangers. And then we go to the Times, Pippa. Overloaded NHS turns to cabins in car parks. Well, they already treat in cabins in car parks, don't they, for eye tests and situations like that. But what is the point? The capacity genuinely is too small right now when you have multiple infections underway like COVID and flu.
Yes, and NHS obviously contending with staff shortages and record waiting times. The suggestion is that temporary cabins could be set up in hospital car parks specifically to ease pressure on A&Es, which is where we've seen some of those awful images and stories from over the last few weeks of patients being treated in corridors and in public areas and sleeping on floors while they wait to get treated. The big issue here is, of course, the number of hospital beds. And, we've spoken to hospitals right across the country, and I'm sure Chris and his team at the Telegraph will have done the same. And, capacity for hospitals in a sort of a normal period might be sort of 85%. 90% hospital beds full. Well, they're right up, some of the big hospitals are right up to 99.5%, and in some cases over 100% capacity. It's very difficult for them to try and create that space. And part of the issue of that is getting people out of hospital and either back to home, or as is often the case, because it's often elderly people in hospital, obviously because they're most vulnerable, getting them into care homes. And there was this package announced overnight last night by the Health Secretary, which I think was £50 million more to be able to discharge. Sorry, no, it was £250 million, wasn't it? More to be able to discharge people into care homes. But the problem there is there's a shortage of care home workers. So there's not necessarily the space that they might envisage. So, there will be a short-term solution for right now. And obviously the government's looking at cabins in car parks in the way that we had during the pandemic for jabs and, like you say, for eye tests and so on. But longer term, clearly there needs to be a structural, a really sort of, root and branch look at capacity in the NHS, and not just in hospitals themselves. As politicians have argued, and not just politicians, but, people in the health service have argued for years, you can't take the NHS in isolation. It has to be the health and social care system. And we've had big promises from the government, from this government, from the last government, particularly from Boris Johnson, talking about fixing the social care problem facing the country on the steps of Downing Street when he took over. Here we are, 3 years on, and still social care is as much as in crisis as it ever was. You can't separate it out from the NHS. If you're going to solve the NHS problem on capacity, you have to look at social care as well.
This is gone. Just very quick sentence then, Christopher. I know you wanted to come in.
Well, I totally right on what Pippa's saying, and that's why they're trying to move several thousands of people out of hospitals now, and release them, to use that term that Steve Barclay used, get them out, get them into somewhere safe in homes, and try and free up bed space in these actual hospitals. OK. We didn't even talk about train strikes and all that. The RMT's leader, Mick Lynch, a little quiet for him, but we'll no doubt talk more later on. And lots more still to come too, including is Prince Harry's portrayal of his stepmother unnecessarily cruel? Discussing that next. Well, welcome back. You are watching the press preview. Joining me once again, Pippa Crerar and Christopher Hope from The Guardian and The Telegraph. Welcome back to both of you. Christopher, should we go to the Financial Times now? And this is the breakthrough in talks with Brussels over Northern Ireland, described as technical but important. So take it away. Yes, and this is what was not what was expected when James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary, met with Maros Sefcovic, the European Commission Vice President in charge of the talks. It wasn't Michel Barnier, if you remember back from your Brexit days. But yeah, they're looking at access for IT systems. This is all about trusted trader status. These are ideas which have been around for a long time. They were first mooted, if I remember rightly, by the ERG, the European Research Group of Tory MPs, in about 2017, 2018. And then were discarded. So this shows, I think, a degree of trust, which hasn't been there before between the UK in London and Brussels, and the EU and Brussels. And that's really been demonstrated by this. I've been, during the break, trying to get hold of colleagues of mine, the DUP in Belfast, and the spokesmen there are being very cool about what's happening here. They're saying that they must replace with arrangements that restore the Northern Ireland's place within the UK, and not to go anything against that. So the concern is that well, there might be a deal on data sharing, and that's agreeing that whatever is in a lorry isn't in a lorry, rather than unpacking it. You know it's there, you trust each other. There's going to be a further agreement, I think, for the DUP to be happy. What's driving this, of course, is President Biden's trip to the UK to mark the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement in March. That's an agreement, that's a deadline which matters to the Foreign Office. It matters less, I think, to some people in Northern Ireland who just want the best deals for themselves.
That's interesting, isn't it? That it's a Biden visit that will eventually drive a solution to this, what seemed an intractable problem. Let's go to the Daily Express, still talking about Harry. Feels like days, doesn't it? But there's been lots more interviews, obviously broadcast. Pippa?
Yes, the Daily Express goes on Harry's cruel attack on Camilla, suggesting that it crosses the red line. This obviously is reference to the latest stinging criticism from Prince Harry towards a member of his family, in this case, King Charles's wife, the Queen consort. Harry has, in his book, accused her of sacrificing him and his brother to rehabilitate their image by trading information with the media when she was trying to win public support after her affair with Charles. Now, there was, of course, historically quite a sort of a long transition in Camilla's reputation with the public. She was the baddie for a long time because she was Charles's mistress for a long period, and the public sympathy lay with Princess Diana at that point. And then when they got together, there was a concerted and long-term campaign to win over public support for her. And you know, she succeeded in that. And a lot of people, if you'd asked 10, 15 years ago whether they thought that Camilla could ever be queen, would have said absolutely not. And there was barely a fuss about it when they announced. I would say.
Sorry for interrupting you there. We need to go to the weather, but lovely to see you both for now. Thank you both very much. Pippa?